Today I have the pleasure of speaking with a team of researchers with whom I have worked closely over the past few months. Together as a group of first and second year students, we participated in the 2021 Undergraduate Big Data Challenge, hosted by the STEM Fellowship, where we won first place, being awarded with the JMIR Infodemic Innovation Award. We wrote a paper titled The Plebeian Algorithm, a Democratic Approach to Censorship and Moderation, which is currently being published. We've also done some research into carbon pricing models and human trafficking, placing second in the hashtag Challenge for Climate Action Datathon by Convergence.Tech. The team consists of myself and 3 of my close friends, 2 of whom could be here today. Russell Frost completed his second year of software engineering at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, Ontario. In all of our many conversations, he consistently brings up deep questions and is able to get to the abstract core of our brainstorm sessions. Also, Kai Fucile Ladouceur. I met Kai in our first year of high school, where he became strongly involved in the Sir Winston Churchill Collegiate and Vocational Institute Robotics Club, taking leadership involvement in his first year of high school. In his final year of high school. At Superior Collegiate and Vocational Institute, at Superior Collegiate and Vocational Institute, Kai took this passion and is currently entering his first year of mechanical engineering at Confederation College, also in Thunder Bay. Today we've been able to function extremely well as a team, going by the pseudonym Aurora Borealis. We met one another through the International Baccalaureate program in Thunder Bay through our high school. I know that we've personally learned a lot from these, or I personally learned a lot from these friends, and I hope that everyone enjoys this conversation and feels the same. Welcome to the podcast, Russell and Kai.
Thanks for having us.
How are you guys doing?
Not too bad. Yourself?
I'm pretty good. I don't like this software, but we won't name the software, but yeah, I'm doing pretty good. So first off, I'd like to start by chatting a little bit about just some like research, general research areas, just broad research topics. So I'm wondering, I guess I'd like to start just by going through both of you and asking, what do you guys like about research? What interests you about research? What sort of topics, I guess, are you interested in researching, perhaps in the future? That kind of stuff. Like, what interests you with research? Let's start with Kai.
Okay, sounds good. So for me, research is something that I think I certainly will get more involved in the future. One of the biggest goals for me in my life is to really go into some sort of research and development of whatever corporation or company or government that might be. It's something I'm really interested in doing and developing new and innovative solutions for some of the problems that we face today. I've recently become very interested in trying to address things like living conditions for places in northern communities, kind of thing, because that's somewhat of a problem here in northwestern Ontario, where we do have certain northern communities who have kind of limited access to resources and materials, and just the overall cold and temperatures make it fairly difficult for living. So that's something I've kind of become interested in, and I think I might want to pursue as a career goal with mechanical engineering, with engineering. The reason why I also just kind of got into it was I think the idea of research development is a really interesting idea of looking into what's currently been done and how can we take the model that's currently been used, can we understand it thoroughly and try to improve upon it, add upon it, all kinds of things such as that. So it's certainly something I find really intriguing. And there's been all kinds of research papers that I've read for even just leisure activity, honestly, just because it's very fascinating to me to learn more and to understand more about these different areas of knowledge. So yeah.
And Russell?
Yes. So when it comes to researching, there's usually 2 different reasons that I'll research. Either A, to answer some sort of question, or B, to fuel some sort of curiosity or need, if you know what I mean. And that need is the need to learn something new about a particular field. For me, I really enjoy software engineering. I really enjoy those abstract logic problems. I find them really fascinating. I also really enjoy studies of metaphysics. I've been reading a lot of philosophy recently. Um, After seeing an interesting lecture on YouTube, which is a great place to find random lectures that professors will just post. Highly recommended to get free university courses, honestly. And he was talking about the links between programmers and philosophers, and how certain views of metaphysics also line up with certain structures that people use to program. Things like object-oriented programming is kind of like the idea of things having some sort of true identity and then existing on Earth only as manifestations of those ideas. That's kind of what object-oriented programming is. You create the class, which is the true idea of something, and then you instantiate objects of that class, which is the things that the users will be interacting with. So, I don't know, there's a lot of really interesting links there that, and that would be mainly what I think I'm really interested in. It's like, how far does that link go?
Awesome. So one final thing before we start going into the Plebeian algorithm, just a quick tip from both of you I'd love to get on, like, for young people interested, like us, interested in getting into research, what would be like the one thing you'd recommend, and try and keep it like not cliched, if that's at all possible. Try and give like the least cliche answer you can to the problem.
I honestly have found that when it comes to research, when I do the most or the best work, I mean, for the first one I would say is finding a group of people to work on this project with. I find doing these projects, like the project that we worked on, was really enjoyable when we were working as a team. Like, we would pull all-nighters, working until 3 a.m. in the morning, quite literally. And even though we were working just tirelessly on this paper and on this research, it was still very fascinating and enjoyable for me. Like, the part of it being enjoying should, I think, be a primary factor, because when you do something that you enjoy and you're interested in, that makes it so you're more productive, right? I mean, I've had so many times. In fact, this kind of ties into my other point, is just having a passion and having these rants. Like, if you have anything like this really interesting thought that you want to pursue, I think, as Russell mentioned, like, just continue pursuing it. Like, continue looking to articles. Like, something I've done is spending hours upon hours just sifting through books and websites and things such as that, just looking at more and more information because a topic was somewhat interesting to me at a certain point, right? So I think having and trying to have this kind of passion for research is really important. Trying to find a group of people you can surround yourself who are equally invested in this kind of research, to kind of act as this kind of energy, like this energy pool that you can take from to continuously kind of keep you going. And then just this sharing of knowledge, right? Like, research in itself, human progression and evolution has really been made possible because of human sharing, right? So having a group of people, I find, to really just discuss ideas with and bounce ideas off and brainstorm is really beneficial in so many ways. And even though that's something I think might be somewhat cliche, having brainstorm ideas and sessions and trying to have multiple minds on a problem, it really is a very good it's a very good cliche, honestly. It's really good to have.
It's almost mystical to some extent.
It really is.
Kind of
It
neat.
really is. In some ways, it's kind of weird because it can also be somewhat addictive, I've found, right? It becomes so, you become so enraptured and just having this fun with people and doing this research and just spending time with people, right? It's honestly, especially when you have a common goal that you're working at, I find it becomes much more enjoyable than simply just hanging out with someone, right? You actually are trying to work together to finish something, and by God, you're going to finish that thing. And by having this group of people that are still all set at, upon the same goal, the same objective, it becomes so thrilling. You just kind of keep pushing yourself to keep going and keep going. And yeah, so that's what I really would suggest for anyone interested in doing this.
Awesome. And Russell?
I would say that something that's really important would be when you're researching, try talking to people who are educated in other fields to see what their takes are. Because oftentimes I think that'll give you unique insights that you wouldn't normally really think of. A great example of this is throughout our paper, I was talking to my Zeta, who is an anthropologist. So I got a really interesting viewpoint from him about some of the ideas in the paper. So I don't know, talking to just lay people as well, it helps you to learn how to communicate the idea a little bit better. If you talk to somebody about like what you're researching and they seem bored, then you're not communicating it effectively, right? Yeah. Also, making sure that your body doesn't phase in and out of existence constantly, like mine is helpful when doing research. Sometimes when typing, just my arm disappears and it's really inconvenient. But what can you do in this?
It's a huge problem amongst software engineers, man. It just happens sometimes. I actually, if I may, I really did want to mention that point, Russell. That was a really well made point about just being able to communicate well, and that's something I don't think enough people, especially in this field, are well versed in. I mean, it's something I've listened to speakers like, I think Richard Dawkins and who else? Oh, he's a neurologist, famous American neurologist and atheist. I can't remember his name. It doesn't come to my mind right now. But many times they've talked about. Oh no, I think it was also Neil deGrasse Tyson. That was another one who had mentioned it. Where as scientists and mathematicians, they're great with the numbers. They're great with actually creating the papers, but actually communicating these ideas, especially to the layperson. A lot of scientists and mathematicians don't really have a good way. They kind of suck at it, right? They don't really have a great way of communicating these ideas to the common person. And that could be a really big challenge and provide a lot of difficulty, because as much as these ideas are great and you've written these beautiful papers, it's really only if you communicate them well and that you get people interested, that these ideas start to sprawl out and really start to flourish. Right. And so, yeah, I would absolutely agree with Russell's point and trying to communicate better, bringing these ideas up just to family members that or friends, right? Just bouncing these ideas off and trying to express it to them in the best way possible, and trying to find ways that might be better explained, right? In many ways that will also give you a better idea of what your actual solution or proposal is, right? I mean, I think it was it Einstein, or I know it's something where by teaching a subject, you become much more well versed in that subject. And that's the same with even research, right? Even though it's you're the one who's made all this research, by explaining it to other people, you get an even better grasp of maybe even just some other implications that you never realized, or people can offer things like potential problems that might be in your paper, right? Simply just communicating and trying to communicate these ideas effectively is really critical.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that I started this podcast too, right? First off, it's really interesting for me to talk to some interesting folks, but it's also helpful for them, and it's helpful for the audience, but it's also helpful for the researcher, right? Because they get to try and put their perspective in a very layperson direction, right?
Sure.
And so I think, since this is the first episode, I think viewers, as this podcast progresses, I think you'll sort of see, you'll be able to see that progression and get to the level of where we're at to some extent over the course of the podcast, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So I guess with that in mind, why don't we move on to talking about our layperson algorithm, the Plebeian algorithm. So just as a little bit of background on it, essentially what we've done is we created an algorithm to help fight misinformation on social media platforms. That we essentially did some data analysis, abstracted away a pure algorithm, theoretical algorithm, and then have come up with various implementations of that algorithm, which we call the Plebeian algorithm. So we try to optimize for freedoms of expression, as well as being able to reduce the effect of spread of misinformation. So I'd love to perhaps hear, either one of you guys, if you want to have a take on what's perhaps just do a quick conclusion, quick summary of the paper, like a few minutes or whatever.
Sure.
Just a general progression of how we got there, what sort of tools we used, that kind of stuff.
Did you want to do it there, Russell, or I'd be willing to as well?
Or if you want to do like both, just split it half and half. One person does like up to the conclude or up to the discussion section, and then the other person does from discussion on. You can do that.
Sorry, I got lost somewhere.
It's fine.
We're just doing a quick summary of the paper. So perhaps if one of you guys wants to take from the beginning to the section on discussion, and then the other one wants to take the discussion to the end, that could work.
Sure. Yeah, I could definitely do that. Let me just pull this up here. I didn't realize we'd be needing the manuscript. That's all good, but
fine.
Yeah. So I can maybe go through that a little bit. So I think maybe for starters, it would be great to kind of talk about just kind of the background for what we were doing. Why did we create this manuscript? And I think you've touched on it a little bit, Ben, about how we were in a competition. And more specifically, the competition's name was the Undergraduate Big Data Challenge, created by the STEM Fellowship. And this was a challenge proposed back in April by this fellowship that are based in BC, I believe. I think it's Vancouver, something like that.
Yep.
And the event was really around this idea of misinformation on social media platforms that has been so pervasive, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has really caused a lot of problems, honestly. And so the big challenge that was set for the groups that were participating was, how can we tackle misinformation in social media? And so we went around about the problem, and we had some discussions on it. And I will say, I honestly, my first thoughts when it came to, in fact, maybe that's something we can maybe even discuss a little bit about is first thoughts. My first thoughts when it first came to the competition is, why do you need to have someone controlling them or moderating this, right? My idea was, by doing that, by trying to moderate, in some ways, you're trying to prevent these topics from being fully discussed, right? And it could end up silencing voices and these kinds of things. It's honestly a concern that's been raised by some people, right, who have had their accounts blocked, who have had content that they've posted censored, right? Censorship has been a big problem for some, and has been a big complaint. And that's something we actually discussed in our paper, where a lot of people who were using Twitter were actually very much fed up with this kind of censorship that they were experiencing, ended up moving on other platforms, things like 4chan, Reddit, or even the biggest one was Parler, right, which was very popular. So it really seemed to me that moderating only just caused people to move away and move to places more discreet, more secretive, where these conversations couldn't be had out in the open. It really just didn't seem like a good idea, right? But we managed to discuss it a little bit more, and my ideas and my views on it kind of changed. And I thought that perhaps maybe having some sort of moderation, where you did have a careful balance between moderating some of the content, but also ensuring that people still had the feeling that they could express themselves freely, would be achievable, and probably would be the best idea, the best way really, of trying to prevent a lot of harmful, honestly, misinformation that has caused people to not accept the vaccines, to taking really, in my opinion, idiotic measures and idiotic choices that have just put more people at risk and in danger. So that was really just my first kind of opinions and thoughts on the issue. How about yourselves?
Russell, if you want to go.
Yeah, so for me, when I first heard about it, my mind immediately went to how big are we making this, right? I was very concerned about the scale of everything, more so than the actual solution initially, right? Because we only had, how long, like a month?
10 days, I think.
10 days?
10 days for the initial submission.
For the initial one, we had a week, yeah. Just more than a week.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We did not have very long. So I was thinking, really, we should probably do some like basic data analysis. Maybe, I think we discussed creating a website. I was saying maybe like a small applet. We didn't want anything too big. And then, writing about the analysis of how that would work. Initially, I was really skeptical of the idea of doing the Plebeian algorithm because I thought the scope would be way too large for us. But as we discussed it a bit more, I think that the data that was already out there definitely made it a bit more doable for creating this like theoretical algorithm. Just a lot of research was needed, and it's difficult, right? Because you have to do the research before you can come up with a solution, because you can't really have a solution before you do the research, because then you're trying to affirm some sort of conclusion with your research, right? True. So I think that it was that initial phase of just like, my first thoughts were, how big should we make this? And then what direction do I want to go in for the research? And I really like I think that at the end of the day, we chose a really good direction.
Well, I mean, evidently, we did really well in the competition, so I would hope so. So yes, absolutely.
So I think myself, I'll just touch on that briefly. I think that I had the idea of abstracting away an algorithm and trying to find the most pure abstract algorithm that we could use, but I didn't have the data direction working for me. Like my thoughts weren't initially to run sentiment analysis, which is what I think we can get into once we get into some of the methodologies there. But I think that that wasn't like my direction. I didn't have any idea of how we would get there. I think my general idea was like, we should find an abstract algorithm that they can implement, as opposed to trying to deal with like individual people or dealing with like a paper for the people. We were dealing with a paper really for software engineers or business, a more business end of viewership, right? Or of trying to reach a more business audience. I think that was generally my thoughts immediately. And then, yeah, and I think it worked out. I feel like Russell had a general better idea for the data analytics side of it, of like what specifically we should be looking at. So I think that was really valuable. But yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. I think that, well, at the end of the day, we all contributed. I mean, like, we couldn't have done it without the group, right? I think it's really interesting when we talk about the ideas that we had, because like when I for clarification for people watching, when I say I had an idea, it's not that I had an idea, it's that I saw something in my research, I said, hey, this is interesting, then we discussed it, right? Mm-hmm. So I found some research, might even be a better way to put it, because even if it came up in conversation, at the end of the day, the idea is developed by all of us, because we start off with some grain and it sucks. And then somebody says, okay, well, your grain sucks and this is why. And then we say, all right, well, what if I do this? And then somebody else, the other person says, that sounds cool. And then the third person comes in and says, actually, no, this is why it sucks and this is why. And then we say, all right, so how do we make that better? And then three of us work on that. And then the fourth person comes in and says, you guys are all wrong entirely. and you have to rework everything. But that's what's so wonderful about the whole process, is that discovery, right?
That's true. That's true. Well, it certainly was, again, a joy to really look into these papers and articles, especially that one you had mentioned, Ben, the whole, I think, crowdsourcing or something for
crowdsourcing layperson algorithm, I believe it was called.
That's right.
Something along those lines.
That's right. Discussing
I'll put a
something
link.
similar to what we finally were addressing in our paper. That was, I think, the turning point for us in many ways, where we first started to go to this idea of creating an algorithm that created this online democracy, right? Instead of just having, as we saw it, and I think I still see it today, as somewhat of an authoritarian, I say that in very loose terms, an authoritarian kind of control over information on social media, because you simply have, and that was something we went to, was you simply have these companies, these social media companies, who are the only ones who are controlling and managing this kind of flow of information. And our idea was, well, what if we just simply said, we leave it up to the people. We let them decide what content they think is true and what content that they don't, because that's something that we've had many discussions on. What is truth, right? What is information? What is facts?
And another angle for this as well, I think, could even go to like advertisability, if that makes any sense. I think that sometimes certain companies will be like, oh, we don't want this posted because once this post hits a certain size, if it gets too big, we're going to be in hot water if we don't remove it. So I think that having that, one really great advantage of the Plebeian algorithm is that it makes the moderation democratic. So you really won't get that from a large portion of your user base.
Well, why don't we break down the Plebeian algorithm? Because I don't think we've fully done that quite yet.
True.
So
it might be helpful to.
Actually, I think it'd be a really good idea if we pulled out. I think I can actually do this on here. Let's pull out the flowchart.
Sure, if you want to try.
Yeah, let me see. I might have to download the PDF. It's downloaded. And then it's on page something or another, page 13.
It might be, I'm not sure whether how the video is gonna work on this. So we'll just reference page 14. So if you want to take a look, I'll throw the page number and the preprint, because I think it might be different on the preprint, in the description of the video. And if you want to take a look, viewers, and pull it up, that'll work.
Yeah, for sure.
So feel free to reference it.
It's not going to be super necessary. It's a pretty simple algorithm. There's three main phases of the algorithm. So initially, the user's going to post something, and the algorithm's going to have to do a little bit of cleaning on that data, because when a user posts something, it might be weird sometimes, right? Sometimes somebody might just post the word fart in all caps, and like the algorithm might not know how to handle that. Is this misinformation? Is this information? What is this? The algorithm gets confused, right? So initially, when somebody posts something, you're going to have to read the post and pick out if it's even a relevant post for like checking for misinformation. There'll probably be a few keywords in posts that will make them more or less compatible with that. For example, if it includes maybe like a medical term or a scientific term, then it might be more likely to get put into the next phase of this, which is after this data cleaning is done, performing some sentiment analysis, which is basically seeing how mean the post is. And what we found is that when you look at a specific subject on social media, and you separate what's misinformation and what's not misinformation, and then you cross-reference that with the sentiment values of those posts, you find that misinformation tends to be a bit more negative in sentiment in that specific, category. So if you have this category and you perform this analysis of how mean the post is, you can flag it for being kind of likely for being misinformation. Now, this isn't always going to be the case, of course, so we need some sort of second check. So then what we do is we're going to take a few users of some social media, and we're going to call them jurors. And jurors will be able to opt into a vote to say whether or not a post is misinformation. Once you get all of the jurors rating the post, you check the average, whether it's true or false, and if it seems to be misinformation, you remove the post, as per the jury, the people's will. So that's the core of the Plebeian algorithm.
Yeah. Well, something I think that's... Sorry, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, what were you going to ask?
I was just going to say, if you want to maybe go off that and perhaps provide some of the more discussion aspects, like some of the stuff that like we looked into, like some of the connections perhaps with naming, that kind of stuff.
For sure, yeah. Well, I mean, the biggest thing when it came to discussions for us was, is this fitting our vision, our initial vision? Like, is this still keeping true to preserving freedom of speech while also reducing misinformation? I think it's important to note that when we were looking into it, our hypothesis was kind of proven, as Russell discussed, where we thought that misinformed posts would generally have more negative sentiment due to the fact that it seemed that more misinformed posts generally were calling for action, right? And generally that action, they were trying to inspire fear and hatred, right? Generally, that's what a lot of, honestly, disinformation, that's something I think was defined as separate terms. There's misinformation, which is the spread of information that is false unknowingly, whereas disinformation is the knowing, like the malicious spreading of misinformation, right? So that was something that we kind of had predicted, and it seemed to have turned out true. Now, when it came to other discussions, like I suppose future areas of research we want to apply this to, we also looked into things like naming conventions and how did the different names that were used affect the overall sentiment. Like, could we find a correlation between using something like the Wuhan virus, right, which is seen as perhaps a non-PC kind of language for referring to the coronavirus, versus something like coronavirus, or even its more scientific name like SARS-CoV-2, right? And it did seem like, especially from some of the data we gathered from Parler, which seemed to offer quite a bit for us, that seemed to really distort the slopes when they did use terms that were, as we considered, biological, right? So when they use things that were more biologic and scientifically accurate, that term tended to be more positive in sentiment, and so therefore maybe perhaps less misinformed posts, whereas the more negative sentiment posts tended to be, as we named it, geographic, right? And so that's naming things that are based off of like China or Wuhan or things such as that, along that nature. I think so. That was kind of generally the idea we had. We also filtered the data a little bit originally, so we took a look at the general data provided by Twitter and Reddit and things such as this on just the general sentiment overall of certain channels and such. And then we even took certain filters to determine whether or not those would actually increase or decrease the amount of negative sentiment. And that's indeed how we were able to prove that overall negative sentiment was more associated with misinformed posts. So, but something I think, again, just going back to this point of preserving this idea that we wanted to ensure that freedom of speech was constantly assured. And we kept having these very philosophical debates on truth, which was very important. And that's something that was constant in our research. Like, as we kept researching these ideas and trying to develop our idea of this algorithm, we wanted to always go back to this original idea, which had kind of involved us in a more theoretical and very out there concepts, perhaps, about what is truth and things such as this. And in many ways, I think we came up with some really good ideas. For instance, one of the proposals that I was offering, and I think that would be something that we might want to update the algorithm with, is and I think we even saw this on Reddit, where posts, you can either upvote or downvote. And downvoted posts aren't removed, they're simply just less seen by people overall, right? And that was a proposal I wanted to have, where similar to that system, these posts would be seen just simply less overall instead of removed or censored. But also to have these posts perhaps reintroduced by the algorithm, perhaps a month later, or maybe even a couple of months later, to see if indeed this is still a misinformed post, right? Because again, we go back to this idea of truth is kind of an elusive concept and always changing. There's always new debates on certain subjects and new eureka moments, I suppose, on debates and on new discoveries. And so perhaps what was false the day before is actually a fact the next day, right? So that's also something that we've tried to look into, to try and say, hey, can we also try to ensure, is this a way in which we can try to ensure that the truthful information determined by this online society isn't necessarily just dismissed because it wasn't simply I suppose introduced at the proper time, so to speak, right? Because it wasn't considered a fact during its time, right? So that's yeah.
Something else to touch on is, oh, sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we also covered a lot of implementations of the Plebeian algorithm, which I think is also very important when you're thinking about like this overarching theoretical algorithm. How would you actually use it on, let's say Instagram wanted to implement the Plebeian algorithm? How do they do that? And that's sort of those are some of the questions that we looked at. I don't think we actually looked at Instagram in particular because data was hard to get. But we looked at Reddit, 4chan, Facebook, YouTube, Parler, and Twitter, right?
I think, yeah, that's well, we also expanded that later by including things like YouTube and
yeah, I think I think
you said sorry, that. Did you? Oh, yeah. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
My bad.
So something really interesting that I actually came across is that YouTube's very close to the Plebeian algorithm when you look at it. So when you're kind of looking for an example of how a company would implement the Plebeian algorithm, you can actually almost look at YouTube. The only step that YouTube is missing is that democratic step. For them, it's sort of an advertiser democracy. It's not the people don't get to decide, the advertisers get to decide, which is understandable given their legal situation. However, I don't think that the Plebeian algorithm would really allow for advertiser unfriendly content either, because that stuff would also get reported and downvoted and removed. Whether there might even be like a second portion to the Plebeian algorithm where it's not, is this misinformation, but is this just too rude or too vile to go on the platform? If the sentiment's so low, that might be another option to put in the jury phase. I don't know if we actually talked about that or not, but.
Well, I think that was part of like up to the implementation too, right?
Yeah.
Up to like the specific platform implementation, which was a very. It was a very big part of our algorithm, right? Having that abstract, applicable to any like social media platform existing, right?
Yeah. Really quickly, I just wanted to go over the reason why YouTube is kind of plebeian-like, and that's because of its like, dislike, and report features. So realistically, it's more like the plebeian algorithm is more like having a just the report feature. But it is interesting that on YouTube, if you see a comment that appears bad, you can report it and it will actually get removed, which is democratic, I would say. I don't know how many reports it takes. I don't know the exact structure of that, but it is sort of Plebeian algorithm like, having that like-dislike system that ranks the comments, and then the report system, which a lot of other websites have. YouTube just I don't know. It was very interesting. It's I think it's because the comment sections are so isolated that it ends up being a bit more plebeian-like, and also because the channel creators also have a bit more control over that as well. Their individual comment sections, whereas when you look at something like Twitter, creators don't have the ability to moderate their comments. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, I think that's.
I think you can like maybe restrict comments or something, but like you can't, or you can like block people, but.
Well, that's something we mentioned in our paper where we were talking about different methods utilized for handling misinformation. I think we compared eradication versus containment. Eradication, we brought up the example of Twitter and how any example or use of the word COVID-19 has a government website associated with that post. It's a very point and shoot, I think, as we said in the article, where it's simply taking a key word and assessing that as potential misinformation, or at least trying to combat misinformation by trying to address it as quickly as possible. Whereas
you'll shoot half of, or you'll shoot all the things that have COVID-19, and half of them will actually be misinformation, and the other half won't, right?
Right.
So that's your issue. The other half are like scientists who are like talking about COVID and saying like, wear a mask, stay home, COVID is, bad. Yeah. And then like, well, or we had this many COVID deaths in Thunder Bay today, right? Like,
well,
that would get flagged as misinformation.
A very roll of the die kind of thing. Like, you'll sometimes get something where, that's a good thing you had out there because that prevented perhaps one person from falling into this trap of misinformation. But at the same time, you're also affecting people who aren't spreading misinformation, right? Who are just simply caught up in the general kind of attempt at quelling misinformation. They're the casualty, so to speak, of trying to quell misinformation, right? Which can be fairly problematic, as we've discussed, right? This feeling of censorship. And that's something where maybe containment doesn't do, right? Where containment is more along the lines of kind of what we're trying to propose, where we're trying to be more specific and really try to contain the problem, because in many ways you can't eradicate misinformation. The idea that that misinformation, you can just completely get rid of it, is a fairly naive and unfounded claim, right? I think that's something that we really realized with our paper, and in the fact that we're very practical in the way that we proposed it, right? We were very practical. And
one difficulty is not just, it's really difficult to know what is misinformation. I think we've already touched on that, right? Like, what is true? It's a difficult question.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to keep us moving along here, I have two questions, and this is going to be weird. I have two questions, and I'd like both of you to pick one of those questions. It can be the same question between the two of you. It doesn't matter. They're two separate things, right? So, if you both want to answer the same question, or if you both want to answer different questions, it doesn't matter. But I have two questions. I'd like you to pick one of them to answer. And, you can go in depth. Like if you want to do like, 5 minutes or whatever is fine. Then we can probably wrap it up. But so my questions are, the first one is, if you were given the chance to rewrite the paper, what would you write it on? That's the first question. Like, what would you do differently? What would you change? What would it be written on? And then the second question that you could answer is, if you were given the chance to write a new research paper right now, an additional research paper, what would you, like, building off of what we already have, right? What would you build off of our paper and research? And the reason that I ask these two questions is because I think that if someone's interested in researching this area, it might be a good way for them to get into it, right? Now that they're kind of up to the level of where we're at, it might be a good way to get into it. So I don't know, Kai, if you want to start.
Yeah, I can do that, absolutely. So for your first question about if I had to redo it, what would I do? I mean, first of all, I think the paper we've written is great, so I don't think I ever would choose to redo it. But if I did, I probably would try to pick a topic, something closer to along the lines of my original thoughts when we were first presented with the problem. Something where we're looking at how our current algorithms right now for handling misinformation like Twitter and such, and that's actually something we include in our research paper already, but how are they doing at perhaps what's the word, halting misinformation? Are they really that effective? And are there examples, like is just having an open platform just a better idea to have, or should we actually have modifications and restrictions to restrict information? So I probably would write a paper something closer along those lines. Rather than creating an algorithm, especially because when we first came into this project, I personally don't have the level of acumen as perhaps you guys do when it comes to computer science in terms of coding, and somewhat of a beginner in certain senses when it comes to coding and these kinds of things. I'm more of an ideas guy, I suppose, an analyst. But so I probably would try to do something that would probably be a little easier for me to accomplish or more feasible. In terms of a potential, I suppose, future area of research, perhaps, or something that you could add on to the paper, something that has really intrigued me when it comes to this paper, I think we've talked about it a little bit at least, was how something like this could be applied to imagery or videos, right? That was something that was a little bit difficult for us because the comment section are a great way of assessing and analyzing perhaps the content of the videos and these kinds of things. However, the content of the video is also fairly important, and that could also be a very good indicator as to whether or not it could be misinformation. Then again, how would you necessarily implement something like this, right? I mean, especially for a video, would you actually have to have whichever person is doing it watch the entire video? Probably, but I don't know. That would be certainly something that I think would be very critical for our people.
Something interesting to talk about is that YouTube, that's what I wanted to mention about YouTube earlier. YouTube already kind of has a sentiment analysis built into their videos. It'll look for certain like trigger words, like swear words or certain words that might be certain like controversial phrases, that kind of stuff, and it will flag certain videos, make them harder to find, that kind of stuff, based on those terms, based on what they think advertisers want, and that's
but
where
it's still ultimately a point and shoot, right? It may be a machine, like a neural network point and shoot, but it's still a point and shoot, right?
Kind of. It's more like they've done a sentiment analysis thing, but then they layer on top specific subjects, which is kind of what the Plebeian algorithm has to do, right? Because I think we mentioned you can't just look at the entire platform sentiment, because what if two people, like what if somebody just types the word turtle? What does that mean? Is that right?
Well, I think we were talking about perhaps specifically looking at subjects involving politics or even just things that are more heated conversations.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that YouTube has that. They have a little thing that'll flag it if it's like if it has politics or something.
With YouTube,
I think it's just the way that they enforce it is a little bit controversial.
Well, that's exactly, I think, where things get. And I apologize for perhaps cutting into your time. I know we want to finish this up pretty soon, and maybe you want to answer the questions that Ben has proposed. But something I really wanted to mention was the fact that, well, YouTube does have a very good algorithm and a very good program that it's running. The biggest problem is that at the end of the day, it's still a human operator that is assessing these kinds of things. It's one person who's assessing whether or not this is a if this is bad content and decides to remove it or not, right? It's one person, right? And sure, you can have people informing their opinion whether or not that should happen. Whereas with something like this, we're pulling not just from a small group who are working at YouTube, we're pulling from everyone using YouTube, right?
Yeah.
We're pulling it from a much larger group of people.
I just want to give a couple of examples because I know that a lot of people don't really see the whole YouTube removing people thing. Maybe, and I can understand that because from different perspectives on YouTube, it can be difficult to see the censorship of certain content. So I want to give a few examples that I think will sort of convince everybody. At least I think will convince everybody. One of them is the censorship of certain LGBTQ creators. I think that we mentioned that briefly in our paper. We had an article on that somewhere. I don't remember the exact reasons. I think it has something to do with the nature of content described might have something to do with it. And then just the way that the YouTube algorithm does flagging, it's a little bit indiscriminate. And so because it is just like an indiscriminate algorithm and, you know, there's certain weird words and it's just one guy kind of deciding it, sometimes some like just regular sex education content can just get completely removed or channels can get blacklisted. The same thing can happen with harm reduction channels when it comes to like drugs and substances. I know that those channels will often get hit and like removed, or even channels that want to show like weapons. Like if a guy who wants to show off his knives and his guns, he might get taken off YouTube because he's showing guns, which I mean, come on, let a dude show off his guns, you know?
Sure.
So those are just a few
Not
examples.
misinformation.
And I think that, well, it's not misinformation, but this is examples of the YouTube algorithm sort of
Exactly.
going wild, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted to give those examples to sort of support that argument a little bit more. But yeah, when it comes to just expanding the Plebeian algorithm, I think that a very interesting area to look into would be conversation sentiment analysis. That is, finding where people are interacting with each other, like when somebody replies to somebody or something like that, being able to identify that, and then being able to identify how healthy the conversation is, how productive basically it's going. I think that having that ability to like quantify that through some sort of algorithm, give it like a, how would you put it, like what's the word when you're being nice to somebody, score.
Kindness.
Yeah, we'll go with that, like a kindness score for the conversation. I think that would be very useful.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I feel like that's probably a natural stopping point for us. Thanks, guys, for coming out. That was really awesome.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I think this was a good first meeting first podcast for my personal podcast. So I was really happy to have you guys on, and
A lot of fun.
you know, yeah. So thanks everyone for watching, and hope you all enjoyed. And we'll see you hopefully tomorrow for another interesting talk with another.
Yeah, I think that
close colleague.
tomorrow's guest sounds pretty cool. So
that he is very cool. Yeah,
you should tune in for that.
Definitely. See you guys then.
Take
Ciao.
care.